I want to begin with an update on the status of our victims from yesterday's attack. We're aware now that there were a total of 7 people injured yesterday. There are 5 people in hospital, 3 are in a critical condition. The remaining victims have been treated and are recovering at home. I know we are all continuing to think of them and the traumatic experience that they have been through. Before I spend a little bit of time talking in more detail about what we know of the individual involved in yesterday's attack, I want to hand over to Commissioner Andrew Costa to give a little bit more detail about the events themselves. Commissioner Costa.
Thank you, Prime Minister. With our investigation underway, I'm able to reveal some more detail of the events surrounding the attack. I'll not go into forensic detail, as that is the role of inquiries to come. However, there are some things that it's in the public interest to cover now. As I noted yesterday, there was nothing unusual about the subject's routine as he travelled by train to the supermarket in Lynn Mall. In fact, some of his actions yesterday suggested that he was planning for the future. He arrived at the supermarket about 2:27 p.m, and the surveillance team following him observed him take a shopping trolley and start shopping. He was shopping normally for about 10 minutes before the attack started. From a review of in-store CCTV footage, we are establishing a timeline of events. As I noted yesterday, it was about 60 seconds from the time our people became aware of a commotion to when they engaged the offender and shot him. However, CCTV footage has shown that the first stabbing occurred some 60 to 90 seconds before our teams heard shouts and saw people running. I want to explain the context to make it clear how this occurred. As I've said previously, long-term surveillance of a surveillance-conscious subject is very difficult. Surveillance teams must work hard not to be recognised, otherwise the surveillance becomes ineffective. We need to be clear, surveillance is different from a security detail. We have had no legal grounds to detain this subject. Monitoring his actions has been entirely dependent on the surveillance teams being able to maintain their cover as they have watched him over an extended period. These are highly trained specialists who follow international best practice for their tradecraft. They are very good at what they do. Over a period of time, the subject has demonstrated a high level of paranoia about surveillance activity. You'll also appreciate that supermarkets are not operating normally at present under level 4 lockdown conditions. Other people in proximity to the subject are much more conspicuous, and the risk of compromise is greatly increased. As a result, our surveillance staff were not able to move around the supermarket with the subject, although they remained close at the entrance, having observed him start shopping as he had done other times. To be clear, I remain of the view that our police staff acted exactly the way we would have expected them to in this situation, and with great bravery and professionalism. I particularly want to acknowledge the first aid provided by the attending staff and other responders who are well trained, and the members of the public who helped. I have no doubt the first aid rendered has made a very significant difference for the victims in this case. In addition to the attending STG members who are trained in advanced first aid, our other staff attending included a trained paramedic who played a key role in triaging the victims and initiating treatment. We were also helped by members of the public, at least one of whom had an advanced level of training. I want to particularly acknowledge the victims and their families. They will be going through great anguish as a result of this horrific situation, and we will do everything we can to support them. I also recognise that the staff at the supermarket, and indeed at all similar places, will be shocked that such an incident could play out in their workplace. We will provide the best visible presence we can around such locations over the coming period. I want to speak to the actions police now have underway to reassure the public. Firstly, I want to be clear that cases of this type are highly unusual. Whilst there are many people with concerning ideologies, very few of them reach the highest level of concern. And of those, it is this case that has caused us the greatest concern. We continue to pay pay a close eye on the environment, monitoring it for emerging risks. The terrorism threat level remains at medium. I want to acknowledge that events like this can bring out disturbing attitudes from a small proportion of people in our community. We'll be keeping an eye out for unlawful activity motivated by hate. We'll be conducting high visibility reassurance patrols around shopping centres and other places where people gather. I'd like to note that there's already much misinformation circulating about yesterday's events. I'd ask the public to exercise careful judgment about what they believe and the sources of information they select. It's an unfortunate reality that events like this lead to much inaccurate information and speculation being fed into the public domain, particularly online. Finally, I wish to make clear that this incident should not give rise to undue concern amongst the public. This case is an outlier, and we are not looking for anyone else in relation to yesterday's events. Thank you, Prime Minister.
Thank you, Commissioner Costa. You'll recall at the press conference yesterday, I said I wanted to share all of the information we had on the individual who committed the attack as soon as we were able to. Overnight and this morning, work is being undertaken by Crown Law to have the courts allow us to release that information. That has been successful. However, the court has given the individual's family 24 hours to raise any concerns regarding release of certain information. So while I can provide details concerning the individual's criminal history, there are issues relating to his immigration status and actions taken by Immigration New Zealand in particular, which I cannot share just yet. The remaining information I hope we will be able to share within the next 24 hours. I'm also unable to share his name, but I would note this is not something I had any intention of sharing regardless. No terrorist, whether alive or deceased, deserves their name to be shared for the infamy they were seeking. Here are the details that we can provide. The individual who committed yesterday's attack arrived in New Zealand in October 2011. He was 22 years old and travelling on a student visa. It was not known that he held extreme views about violence and terrorism at that time. In 2016, he came to the attention of the police after he expressed sympathy on Facebook for recent terrorist attacks, violent war-related videos, and comments advocating violent extremism. He was spoken to by the police twice, once in April of 2016 and then again in May. This activity online continued, and in May of 2017, he was arrested at Auckland International Airport. Police believed at that time he was heading to Syria. A search of his apartment led them to discover restricted publications and a hunting knife. He was charged with possessing these things. He eventually pleaded guilty to charges of knowingly distributing restricted publications, fraud, and failing to assist police in the execution of their search powers. He was released on bail. In August 2018, whilst on bail, the individual bought a knife. The police arrested him again, but also issued a search warrant and found objectionable or extremist material. He was charged with additional charges of possessing objectionable material, possession of an offensive weapon, and failing to assist the police in exercising their search powers. On this occasion, he was kept in custody. In September 2018, the individual was sentenced to 12 months supervision in relation to the first set of charges. He remained in prison due to the additional charges that he'd already committed while on bail. In September of 2018, ministers were briefed and then directed officials to undertake further policy work on counter-terrorism legislation. Work progressed throughout 2019, and this included policy work to criminalise preparatory acts which might be related to a terrorist intent or plan. Meanwhile, in July of 2020, the Crown made an unsuccessful attempt to lay an additional charge under the existing Terrorism Suppression Act for the knife and online posts, but this was rejected by the High Court. The original criminal charges of unlawfully possessing these items were still valid though, and so throughout this period he was remanded in custody awaiting sentencing. You may also be aware that during this time he assaulted corrections officers and faced charges on these acts also. In the meantime, work on changing the law to add an offence of committing a preparatory act progressed, and a draft bill was introduced in Parliament in April 2021. It had its first reading in May. Now, throughout this period, officials met a number of times to consider what avenues could be pursued to address the risks posed by this individual and to prepare for the potential that we may run out of legal avenues to detain him. I was briefed on this particular work in May 2021. I sought further advice on whether prevention orders could be used and whether the individual had been psychologically assessed. I was later advised that prevention orders could not be used and that he had refused psychological assessment. At this time, work around his immigration status was also underway, but this is detail I am hopeful I can share more with you on tomorrow. In May 2021, he was convicted in the High Court on the charges of possession of objectionable publications with knowledge and failing to assist the police in exercising search powers. He was found not guilty of another charge of possessing objectionable material and the charge of possessing a knife in a public place. On the 6th of July, he was sentenced to 12 months supervision with special conditions. These conditions included that he must reside at the named address, could only possess an electronic device capable of accessing the internet other than that provided by his probation officer. He was also required upon request to make available any electronic device to the probation officer for the purpose of checking or cloning the device, and to disclose to his probation officer and provide access to all social media accounts. He was also required to attend rehabilitation, assessment and treatment. GPS monitoring was sought by the Crown, but this was not imposed by the courts. At the time of sentencing, the individual had spent approximately 3 years in prison on remand. He remained in custody, but given all legal avenues to continue his detention had been exhausted, officials prepared for his release. Risk mitigations were already underway. This included police standing up surveillance coverage, including the use of the Armed Special Tactics Group. This is the group who were present yesterday at the scene and shot the terrorist. Police also worked alongside the NZSIS. Corrections also advised that he would be reporting to the Newlands Service Centre, where there would be a police presence. Prior to his release, police identified that he could be arrested without a warrant for breach of his conditions, and that there were other trigger points which would allow him to be arrested, including committing or threatening to commit a violent act, acquiring weapons, or consuming objectionable material. In mid-July, the individual was released into the community and the surveillance began immediately. In late July, I was given a written update on the case. On the 9th of August, I met with officials and discussed further options to try and reduce the risk that this person posed to the community. In late August, officials, including the Commissioner of Police, raised the possibility of expediting the amendments to the counter-terrorism legislation. Within 48 hours of these discussions, the Minister of Justice contacted the chair of the Select Committee with the intention of speeding that law change up. That was yesterday, the same day the attack happened. As you can see, agencies used every tool available to them to protect innocent people from this individual. Every legal avenue was tried. But we owe it to everyone to have other people look at the facts of this case too, to analyse them, to see what was done and what more could have possibly been done. The IPCA and the coroner will be an important part of this work. But we must also look forward, as we have always done. We must be willing to make the changes that we know may not necessarily have changed history, but could change the future. We already have changes to the terrorism suppression laws underway, with the departmental report just being reported back to Select Committee. That means the public have had their say, and now Parliament must act. I'm committing that as soon as Parliament resumes, we will complete that work. That means working to pass the law as soon as possible and no later than by the end of this month. I want to thank the Leader of the Opposition for reaching out to offer her support for this course of action. There is one additional piece of work that I instigated in August, which is also relevant to this case. Unfortunately, it requires the suppression order to be lifted, so I'll provide an update on that when that occurs. To finish today, I have two final things I want to say. The first is to the New Zealand Police. You are tireless, and I am told at times you had up to 30 people involved in monitoring this person. I want to acknowledge the work that you did leading up to this event and the work you do generally to keep us all safe. I also want to acknowledge those who responded at the scene and say thank you. And to the Auckland community, times are tough, and I know that you'll be feeling it right now, but we are all with you. The last thought I will leave is from the Imam of Al Noor Mosque, who knows the impact of terrorism better than anyone. He said, and I quote, "All terrorists are the same, regardless of the ideology. They stand for hate. We stand for peace and love." We have it within our powers to ensure that the actions of an individual do not create a knock-on of hate, judgment and vitriol. I know, New Zealand, you'll be kind. Please wrap your arms around all of our victims, those of yesterday and those of the past. Yeah, I'll come to you, Jessica, and then I'll come to you, Toba.
Did the law fail New Zealanders?
You can see that at every turn, every legal avenue that was available was utilised. And when it was no longer possible to legally have this person detained, that is when the police came in with that constant monitoring. But what you can see, and overseas examples have demonstrated also, when you have a highly motivated lone actor like this individual, it is incredibly tough.
So
I'll let you finish.
You have a situation though where this person was allowed out into the community, and police obviously felt they had to monitor them in this situation. So clearly, you had the Commissioner saying he was concerned, you had judges saying there were gaps in the law, and yet only the day of the attack the Minister looked to speed things up.
Look, I don't think it's fair, and you'll see legal experts saying this as well. I do not think it's fair to make an assumption that that law change in itself would have made the difference in this case. We don't know that to be true. But what you can see, that based on the level of offending we had, those legal avenues were all used. Everything available to us was used. And when we were exhausted those options of keeping that person in prison, that is when the monitoring stepped in. But this was a highly motivated individual who used a supermarket visit as a shield for an attack. And that is an incredibly tough set of circumstances. We used everything we could, though.
In 2018, ministers were briefed about the need for planning and preparation to be included in the counter-terrorism legislation. Why weren't those changes made back then? Well,
so, of course, successive governments before us, of course, had this issue raised. My recollection is that was the first time it was raised with us. That's my recollection, was in 2018. And we immediately gave the nod for that work to be undertaken. So that was undertaken, and once that policy work was complete, we started the process of drafting. In between, of course, the March 15 attacks occurred as well. So we did act on that legislative change, but it is purely speculative to say that even that law change would have made a difference for this particular individual.
He wasn't on the radar when he came in the country from 2011 until 2016. That suggests that he was radicalised in New Zealand. Is there anything you can tell us about how that process might happen?
I don't know. I simply don't know enough about those intervening years to say that would necessarily, how that necessarily occurred. All I do know is that the first point at which we saw material posted on Facebook that was cause for concern was 2016. So there was a delay from the point that they arrived in New Zealand until we saw that occur in 2016.
And that's the way, if you were briefed in 2018 and you started that work immediately, the legislation wasn't introduced until April this year.
So there are points, and I'm happy to share the timeline, points alongside in the policy process that are all completely normal that occurred in between time. The policy work was done, then it came back to a Cabinet committee to be approved, then Cabinet approval for the drafting. It's all completely in line with the usual policy process. But what I would say is successive governments did not instigate this work. We did. We wanted to make this law change, but it is still really speculative to say that even that would have made a difference here. And I'd also again, looking at the level of offending, you can see this individual was kept in prison for as long as we could. He was charged with objectionable material and, on occasion, for possessing a knife. So we were continuing to pursue those channels as a way of keeping him in prison, but eventually that was no longer viable, and that's when the police stepped in. And that's something I want to speak to. Unfortunately, that's the element that the 24 hours is still holding us back on. So I think you'll be able to see exactly what happened there as well. So we'll release that as soon as we can, but that story really tells itself as well.
Prime Minister, just on...
Sorry, I'll come to Jane and then I'll come through the front.
Was there any opportunity through the legal process for the Crown or the police to appeal against any of the sentences or consideration of that?
I'll let Commissioner Costa speak to that.
We have pursued all avenues with this case including reasonably creatively at times to try and manage it. There's some evidence of that in relation to the TSA, Terrorism Suppression Act application that we brought. So we have explored every opportunity to manage the case.
Were there any opportunities for appeal? Were they taken, or was that just not an avenue that was open given the court proceeding?
We did pursue an appeal. There was an appeal in relation to the charges that were brought in 2018, so that matter was upheld on appeal. The decision of the High Court regarding the Terrorism Suppression Act, I'm not sure the fine detail of the decision-making there, but I think it's fair to say that we accepted the judge's view was an accurate view of the law.
Coming back to the 2018, so that was an appeal against the year's supervision because he'd been in prison for 3 years in custody. Was that what the appeal, was it against the sentence?
No, I believe that was an appeal he brought. So he was convicted and the matter was appealed and upheld on appeal.
You mentioned
Just on the
I'll come in through the front. One thing I probably should just add, given the interest in the legislation that was being drafted, that would not have been able to apply retrospectively to any information that was already held around this individual. So it would only be able to apply to anything that we were able to detect through monitoring and so on of the individual. And under what we had drafted, it would be a person commits an offence if the person carries out a terrorist act within the meaning of Section 5A by planning or other preparations to carry out this act, whether it is actually carried out or not. So there is a threshold that still needs to be met, and it wouldn't have been able to be retrospective.
The government had passed those laws and
Yes.
these provisions had been in place.
Yes.
That would have captured.
So that existing law was, the police did seek to, under the existing law, seek to charge the individual and prosecute the individual. That was in July of 2020. That was unsuccessful.
I mean, the ones before Parliament at the moment,
Yes.
if the provisions had been passed by either earlier by your government or
Yes.
by a previous government,
Yes.
these would have helped. It would have applied to this situation.
Only at the moment in time that it were passed, and so that would then, so that would then require a level of knowledge and monitoring to be able to ascertain a preparatory act by the individual. And you can see by the pattern of behaviour here, we had objectionable material, we had possession of a knife. That's why I keep pointing out it would be speculative to say whether or not this law would have made that difference, but nonetheless, we were pursuing it.
Just on the
in the
timeline
front.
of the incident itself yesterday, Commissioner Costa said that there was a 10-minute period where it appeared that the offender was shopping. Is that because he knew that he was being, does your information suggest that the person knew that they were being tailed and that they were essentially trying to throw the tactical unit off the scent?
There are two options here. One is that he planned it and he was very clever in the way he planned it to make it look like a normal day, or that it was opportunistic and something that he did at short notice. We will probably never know the answer to that. We do know he was surveillance conscious, and we have been watching him carefully, knowing that he operates in that way, but we won't know.
You say with 100% certainty that the knife for the attack was acquired within the store and the person didn't bring it from home, as the history would have suggested. As the Prime Minister said, they've got a history of knife crime or planning.
A history of possession of knives.
We're still undertaking our scene examination. What I can tell you is that CCTV shows him removing a kitchen knife from the shelves in the store, and a knife fitting that description was found close to him after he was shot. I can't rule out until we've completed our scene examination that there were no other weapons involved that might now be somewhere in the store, but nothing suggests to me anything other than the knife was obtained in the store.
I'll come to Claire in a minute.
Please, Commissioner, can you just clarify two things? One, the 7 injured people, were they all as a result of the stabbing, or were any bystanders hit by police bullets? And secondly, the timeframes within which it happened, was it 60 to 90 seconds before police became aware of it, and then a further 60 seconds before they ended the situation, or shorter?
That's correct. So they, as I said yesterday, responded within 60 seconds of hearing shouts, seeing people running. But what CCTV footage has revealed is that the attack started 60 to 90 seconds prior to that. In relation to your first query? Sorry, you just have to ask me that question again.
The 7 people injured, were they all as a result of the stabbing or were bystanders hit by police?
Thank you. So all of the injuries, as far as we can assess, were due to the offender's actions. There's no evidence of anyone being struck or injured as a result of police actions.
I'll come here and then back into the back.
So on the idea of a psychological assessment for the man, I mean, you said he declined it. He was court ordered to take one of these assessments, correct? Was he able to decline it?
So again, I'm recalling the briefings that I received at the time. I don't have information on a court-ordered psychological assessment or not. What I'm aware of is, of course, there were psychological assessments involved in corrections work around the offender, as is usual practice in some of these cases, as I understand. I was really seeking for other reasons. I was trying to assess whether or not this was an individual that could be sectioned. Again, this was all part of our exhausting every avenue to determine whether there were other ways that we could continue to detain someone that we were concerned was a risk. So I was told that he had refused, and there was no suggestion at that point that we had the ability to mandate or require it. I can't answer the court-required psychological assessment.
It's fair to say that he has been generally uncooperative with any of the efforts to modify his behaviour or address the underlying issues. So I can't speak to the specific instance, but as a general statement, that is true.
Yeah.
Between July and now, I mean, you spoke of possible trigger points that you were looking out for to detain him again, I believe. Did anything occur during that time? Were any threats made? Had he acted in any way that raised a flag during that time?
Some of this detail will come out in the fullness of subsequent inquiries, but certainly nothing occurred that would give a legal ground for us to intervene with him in any other way than what we did, which was...
There were moments you sort of held out and hoped that something greater would happen. You know what I mean?
The law that we're working with required the first step to have been taken in order for us to be able to intervene. So we might have an understanding of intent and ideology, and we might have high levels of concern, but that is not sufficient for us to take any enforcement action.
Unless, of course, that involves some of the other provisions that we had already identified. And as I said, the police were without a warrant able to detain him for a range of other reasons, if he acquired a weapon and so on. So there were a list of things that we could act on and would have acted on if they arose. I'll come to Joe if I can.
Just a couple of questions. Firstly, Commissioner, if you sought to expedite those that precursor law, had anything happened that suggested that something was going to
Joe,
take
before
place
that starts, can I just give just a little bit of context? That was not the first time officials, of course, raised what they perceived to be the importance of that legislation. Our very first briefing on it in 2018 was from officials wanting to bring to us this issue of what they perceived to be a gap in the law. So although it was raised recently, there was really consistent ongoing advice from officials that we should do this, and that's why we were. So I just wanted to give that context. Commissioner Costa.
Prime Minister. Certainly, as the Prime Minister's noted, there has been a long conversation about the law. In relation to most recent events, the primary factors on my mind were information available to me that suggested nothing had changed his outlook and he had a hardened attitude in terms of what he hoped to do. And we had been surveilling him when this occurred for 53 days, and I was concerned about the sustainability of the surveillance operation, and that was what led to the most recent escalation.
And the sustainability of the ongoing monitoring was something that officials were discussing as well. So as soon as he was released, a very intensive effort went in, but there was a conversation over what are the longer term options here for this individual.
Prime Minister, in terms of the law, and you've said that it might not have captured this person, so is it really fit for purpose in that case? And given you've got the likes of legal experts, Islamic Women's Council, Amnesty International, all saying that there are gaps in this draft legislation, in terms of pushing it through, is it really fit for purpose?
Well, it has gone through, as you can see, quite a rigorous process, and for all those who might have said that we should have done it more quickly, the law that you're discussing is the one that we've put through that full process, and because often this is very tricky legislation to draft because someone has not committed a crime. And so you're really coming in very, otherwise earlier than most of our legal provisions would allow. So that's why it's gone through that process. We've gone out publicly on it. People have submitted on it. Our view is now that people have done that, though, we have an obligation to move on that legislation. And the Select Committee would have considered all of that feedback that came through, as would the Ministry.
Criticisms are very loud and clear still today in terms of the gaps in that legislation. So
Yeah, and again, I'd leave you to look at the provisions that have been drafted around preparatory acts. They have been well considered. They have engaged legal experts in order to try and create provisions that cover off what we currently do not have in our legislation. I'll come to you, Tova and then Ben.
Do you have confidence in all of the actions that immigration has taken in relation to this individual?
Yeah, this is something that, of course, is a part of the timeline that I've had to draw out and what I've shared with you today. But I think you'll see when we are able to share that information that every possible avenue that was available to us was pursued. Every possible avenue, and I would include in that immigration.
And at any point did New Zealand First and the previous government try and have this person deported, but Labour ministers somehow blocked that?
No, not at all. And I think there will be a very clear picture painted around what efforts were being made in this space. Sorry, Ben, I did say I'd come to you.
Police Commissioner Costa, are you satisfied that the agents needed to use lethal force yesterday?
Absolutely, without a doubt. This man had attempted to kill at least 6 people and was advancing them at pace with a knife, so absolutely.
And the New Zealand Herald plastered him obviously on the front page a couple of weeks prior. Is there any suggestion that this might have triggered or inflamed the man?
I don't think that I can point to any one event or incident. We've been concerned about his attitude for some time, and I can't point to any particular trigger. As I've noted, his actions yesterday led us to believe that he was following a normal routine, and we did not anticipate that there was anything pushing him to act right now.
You had a situation.
Last one, Ben, and then I'll come back to Jessica and then background. Oh, sorry, you have it.
The 2016 thing that he picked up from the comments on Facebook, what was the event that he was commenting on?
My recollection is that there was a bombing event in Europe. Is my recollection. Yeah. So I'll come down the back and then back to you, Jessica.
Commissioner Costa, at the start you mentioned that when the attacker was at the supermarket yesterday, before they started the attack, that some of their behaviour suggested that they might be planning for the future. Can you explain that a little bit further, and I guess what actions he was, what made you say that?
That related to events earlier in the day, and I am not at liberty right now to go into the detail of what that is, because some of that is sensitive. So that may well come out in future inquiries, but what I can say is it was clear that he had a vision beyond the day yesterday.
Doing bits and pieces that suggested that he was going to be here in a week's time or 2 weeks' time, if that makes sense. Jane. Oh, sorry, Jessica, I did say come to you and then back to Jane.
Commissioner, you had a situation where you had up to 30 officers over 53 days working following this guy. How frustrating was it for you that the law was allowing this person to be out in the public?
It's our job. It's what we do. And we operate within the bounds of the law as it is, and we're able to have conversations with other officials and ministers about options to change the law, and our Prime Minister's talked about some of the history of that. So, we work within the law, and we were absolutely doing everything we could.
You as Police Commissioner, though, were you not frustrated by the bounds that were set?
Look, I'm always looking for how we can keep our communities safe. I fully recognise and respect that the law is set by Parliament, not by us, and we enforce it. We, of course, want every opportunity to keep our communities safe, but equally recognise that there's a balancing act in how that is achieved.
Can I check something with you as well? We know that there's extra security around the Newland supermarket, extra police presence around the supermarket at the moment. Is that more widespread, or is it just Newland, and if so, why is that?
we will. So we're still sort of examining the scene there. So partly our presence will just relate to the investigation. As I noted in my comments, we will be providing high visibility presence around as many supermarkets and places of gathering as we can. That is for no reason other than to reassure the community.
I'm very aware.
Jane.
I'm very aware of the sensitivities because it was a person who was attacked. But are you able to give any more detail or paint more of a picture about that first 60 seconds and how he was able to disguise or hide the fact that he had already attacked somebody?
As I said, the surveillance staff with the way supermarkets are operating at the moment, we're not able to follow him around the supermarket without being compromised. So he shopped for 10 minutes, he was moving around the supermarket, they monitored from a location where they felt that they could maintain their cover, and then obviously events occurred. I can't tell you the reason for the gap between the attack starting and that being evident in terms of shouts and running. However, it's quite possible that it started more quietly, but I don't want to speculate about that. That will come out in the fullness of time.
I'll come Claire, then Jason, and then back to
People will be slightly confused about why it took so long and whether or not there were police in the supermarket ready to respond. Or you mentioned something before about the lockdown rules potentially impacting on what they might normally do.
There's not as many people and it's harder to disguise that you're surveilling someone.
Yeah, so we have surveillance teams that are highly trained to stay in touch with somebody and observe them without themselves being observed. And that means they can't be standing next to them. And that means they can't be passing them every 30 seconds because over a period of weeks they will come to be recognised. So they adopted the tactics they were able to in that environment, noting that it's much sparser in those environments now than it normally is. I'm confident they did absolutely everything they could, and this response was fast. If you look internationally at these kinds of situations, a motivated attacker, even under surveillance, is going to be hard to manage, and that has been demonstrated many times overseas.
You mentioned before you were looking at whether or not the operation was sustainable. What did you mean by that? Does that and what kind of do those extent operations cost?
It's not a cost issue. It's really about the fact that we have a relatively small number of these highly trained staff, and running surveillance operations for extended periods increases the risk of compromise in terms of being identified, but also just recognising that this person was surveillance conscious. He's using counter-surveillance methods. He had challenged members of the public about whether they were surveilling him, highly paranoid, and so all of that gave real cause for concern about the risk of compromise.
Jason.
Brian, just one for now, and then maybe at the end of the press conference you could come back to it about the question about COVID. But for now, have you been in touch with the Sri Lankan government or vice versa about this individual?
No.
Would you expect to within the coming days?
My focus is very much on the community here and ensuring that they are safe and that they are well. Because as I just repeat what I said yesterday, this is about an individual and their acts and has nothing to do with ethnicity, culture or religion.
I'll
come into the front and then back to Toda.
Just on the question of cost of the surveillance teams, I mean, are you able to give an indicative cost of what it costs police to run that kind of an operation?
I can't. We will be able to, but it's not a relevant consideration in this case.
And was the case of this man discussed at Cabinet, particularly during the last government, and what were those conversations like?
There are specific ministers that would be aware of individual cases like this. Keep in mind that as well as being Prime Minister, I hold the role of Minister for National Security, so of course it was relevant for me to be aware of this individual. But that is, as Commissioner Costa has said, this is a very rare set of circumstances. So whilst there were some discussions and briefings, it was always with those ministers for whom it was relevant to.
We're talking about the consideration of whether you could have them sectioned. Obviously there's some sort of consideration as a mental state, right?
Look, and I should be clear that this was, I was getting semi-regular briefings, as you can see, near the end of us coming to a point where, after having been detained for 3 years, we were reaching a point where all the legal avenues were being exhausted. And there were a couple of processes I wanted to check that we had pursued as well to ensure we'd done everything we could to maintain that level of safety that was as high as it could be. Of course, there was the option of surveillance afterwards, but ultimately we wanted to deal with this in alternate ways. That was one of the options I asked about, but obviously it was not considered realistic, nor were the prevention orders. There was one other channel that we pursued comprehensively. That was probably one of the most frustrating avenues, and we'll be able to share a bit more on that tomorrow. Yep.
Question, sorry, is that did you ever consider whether some of the measures being taken were exacerbating this man's condition and possibly driving him
No, nothing that ever suggested that, because the behaviour was consistent and the response to interventions appears to have been consistent as well. So you can see right at the beginning in 2016 that intervention of having the police talk to the person, warn the person, try and engage the person, that occurred right from the beginning. And
it's partly, sorry, Prime Minister, it's partly the reason too why covert surveillance was the right option. Had we put people walking beside him, for example, as some might like to suggest, A, there was a high risk of that precipitating an attack by him, but B, increased the chance of him fleeing in a way where we couldn't keep watching him and manage his behaviour.
And whilst I asked that question, just as a genuine inquiry, there was no suggestion that that threshold was ever met. At that point, we were asking all of the questions about this individual. Back to you, Jessica, and then I'll come back through those in the front.
How did it work with SDG? Were they with the surveillance team the whole time, or were they sitting outside? Can you just explain how that worked?
I won't go into fine detail on their tactics, but they stay in very close proximity, and the SDG team were able to hear shouts and see the running. So they, yes.
And SDG in that situation, would they be uniformed or no, plainclothed?
No, they were plainclothes.
And were the only ones armed? The surveillance team was armed?
I believe some of the surveillance team were also armed, but I'm not going to go into the fine detail of that. You know, those tactics obviously are kept secret for obvious reasons.
Is it unusual, though, for the surveillance team to be armed? Because I understood that it wasn't.
I'm not going to go into the detail of that. To be fair, I would need to check whether they were or they weren't. So it's not appropriate for me to speak to that. But this offender was known to present a risk, and that's why we had STG staff there. They are the ones trained with that high level of tactical skill. If you think about engaging someone in a supermarket with other people around, you want to make sure you're going to know where those shots are going to go.
I'll come Tova, then Joe, then Ben.
Following on from Ben's earlier question about lethal force, and sorry if this is coming from a slight place of ignorance because I'm not sure what the training or the process is, but do officers in that situation, do they shoot to incapacitate or do they shoot to kill?
They shoot to incapacitate. And in this case, that's exactly what they will have done. We don't execute. What we do is we remove the threat.
I had Joe, then Ben.
Can I just get some clarification in terms of legislation? So
Yep.
their position of objectionable material, I understand, is a maximum of 10 years.
Correct.
prison,
Yep.
Whereas the Preparing for a Terrorist Act is a maximum of 7.
Yes.
So if this person had actually come under that new legislation, would that have resulted in a longer sentence or not?
A hypothetical, but you're right to point out that actually the individual could have feasibly been detained for longer and wasn't. That's an illustration, I think, of actually the level of offending that we had to work with. So objectionable material and possession of a knife. And so you can see that led to detention for periods of time. And 3 years, essentially was the point at which we had those last charges that then led to his release. That I think just points to the real difficulty of this situation, but also that we were just using every avenue possible.
Just to come back from, it was a question earlier but it kind of got missed. If you were concerned that this person wouldn't have actually fitted into this legislation, how is it fit for purpose if it wouldn't have captured this?
No, all I'm saying is that I can't speculate as to whether or not they would or they wouldn't have. So when the gap in the legislation was raised with me in 2018, I don't recall it being about a specific individual. I recall it being about the fact that there was a view that there was an addition that needed to be made to our legislation. And so it stood on its own terms that we needed something in this space. Subsequently, of course, a lot of discussion as to whether or not this person would fall into it. And certainly when you've got someone being monitored 24/7 or for consistent periods of time, you want to ensure that if you do discover something that you've got all the legal tools that you need. So that's another reason why going forward it would be a useful piece of law.
Prime Minister,
Ben?
on the victims, just to follow up from yesterday, is there any information to suggest the man was targeting men, women, Pākehā, or is it totally indiscriminate?
I have nothing to suggest that would be the case.
Absolutely no suggestion of any targeting, simply people who were nearby.
Okay. And can you also, I know you described 3 people in a critical condition, can you give any further information as to the nature of those injuries or whether they are life-threatening?
Look, I know that 3 are critical, and actually whilst I have little bits of extra information, I'm also aware of those individuals and their families' privacy. So, yes, and actually I'm going to start wrapping, so I'll come to you in the front. I might finish. Finish.
What you said earlier on, this man being an issue in 1 to 2 weeks.
Sorry, what was that?
What you said earlier about this man being an issue in 1 to 2 weeks, is that in terms of his movement, or?
Forgive me, I couldn't hear the beginning of your question.
Oh, sorry, this man, what you said earlier about this man being an issue in 1 to 2 weeks?
An issue in 1 to 2 weeks.
So was that to do with his movement?
And maybe had a future plan?
Oh, sorry. So the question was there anything to indicate that something was going to happen on that day? And the Commissioner was being asked what he meant by the fact that there was nothing in the sense that he was planning for the future. That was just me giving an example of what planning for the future might mean.
Also, you were saying yesterday that there wasn't,
I think that's actually something we could probably clarify in some of our possible future information.
You were saying that there's very few people who were at the level of concern that this man was. That's not zero, including this man. How important is it that we get these laws across? Yeah,
so look, it's important that we put these laws in place because we want all of the tools available to us to protect New Zealanders. And that's not to say this scenario would have fitted into this law, but it's still an important change that we believe needs to be made. In terms of the wider threat, I think actually Commissioner Costa said it best when he acknowledged that this actually was a person that we were all particularly focused on. And there are very few people that I would describe fitting into this category of this individual.
Prime Minister, could we please ask you about the COVID? Can we ask you a couple of questions about COVID today?
I'll keep it just to a couple if I can, just out of fairness, because we haven't identified this as being a COVID briefing. So I'll come for one final one from Claire, and then you indicated you wanted one on COVID, and then I'll give one more if that's okay.
I have one which is 2, and the one in particular is clarification about that. You said there were 7 injured, and then a bit later you said the man had stabbed 6 people. How did the 7th get injured? And also in terms of, you've talked about extra security around supermarkets. Are you also looking at providing more security around mosques in the case of retaliatory attacks or even a backlash against maybe some in the Muslim community? Like, what are you doing in regards to that?
Okay, thank you. So in relation to the people injured, obviously the picture has unfolded over time, and what would have been clear to the officers right then is that he was undertaking a violent attack, and we knew the history of this person, so they knew what they might be dealing with. In relation to the victims, there was a 7th identified overnight. That person narrowly missed being stabbed but did suffer an injury from the knife and managed to get out of the way and self-treated at home, and then we discovered him overnight. So of the victims, we have 3 in a critical condition in hospital, 2 are stable in hospital, and 2 are recovering at home.
Okay.
In relation to the other query, we will provide high visibility patrols in a range of places. Of course, we are concerned when things like this happen that particular communities are targeted, and I would say that is a completely faulty logic. The only person responsible for what happened here is this man.
Come in front. Oh, sorry, who was it?
It was me, but Tova can have it.
Tova, go ahead.
Sadly, we've had our first COVID death today from this outbreak. What can you tell us?
Yeah, it was with great sadness that I was advised this morning that we have had someone pass away from COVID-19 as part of this most recent outbreak. And it's, again, just a deeply sad reminder of why all of the measures we're undertaking right now are so important. And it's to ultimately protect families, loved ones from experiencing this vicious virus.
Today's case numbers, 20 today, so we are still seeing that trend, that drop off. What is that encouraging,
Yes.
and what could it mean in terms of alert level shifts? Is it looking good for Auckland to come down?
Yeah, a bit early to say what the numbers mean for us going forward yet, but what it does show us is that all of that effort and energy that Auckland is putting into level 4 is making a difference. So that's a reason to stick to it. The more that people follow those rules now, the sooner we'll get to a place where we can lower them. So just a message of thanks to everyone. It's making a difference, and you can see it every day. Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.